Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Diversity in Science seminar. My name is Jessie Villanueva. I am an associate professor at the Molecular and Cellular Oncogenesis program here at the Wistar Institute, and I also serve as the Associate Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Ellen and Ronald Kaplan Cancer Center. It is a pleasure to gather this afternoon virtually and celebrate the launch of our Diversity in Science seminar series as part of our commitment to D&I. The goal of this seminar series is to highlight the extraordinary work and life experiences of diverse scientists, as well as learn and celebrate their efforts to foster D&I in biomedical research. I am thrilled to introduce this afternoon our distinguished inaugural speaker, Dr. Marie Bernard, who is the NIH Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. Dr. Bernard received her undergraduate education at Bryn Mawr College, where she obtained a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and her MD from the University of Pennsylvania. She then trained in internal medicine at Temple Hospital here in Philadelphia, where she also served as chief resident. Before joining the NIH, Dr. Bernard was an endowed professor and founding chair of the Donald W. Reynolds Department of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine. She has held numerous leadership roles, lectured and published widely in her area of research, with a special focus on underrepresented groups. As a champion of diversity and inclusion throughout her career, Dr. Bernard has served in various leadership roles. She has received several awards, including the NIH Director Award for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in 2020. She's a thought leader and a role model promoting diversity, inclusiveness, and equity throughout the biomedical research enterprise. Today, Dr. Bernard will discuss enhancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the NIH approach. If you have any questions for Dr. Bernard, please post them in the Q&A section, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Bernard, for joining us today. The stage is yours.
Thank you ever so much, and it's really lovely to have the opportunity to join you today. I'm kudos for getting this lecture series started. As noted, I'm going to talk about enhancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the way that we look at those things from the NIH perspective. Let me just get my laser pointer going. There we go. And so I'm going to first talk about why we should focus on diversity, what's the evidence for the impact of diversity and where we are relative to diversity in the biomedical workforce. Then I'm going to talk about what we are doing at NIH. In particular, we have a strategic plan for DEIA because we talk about accessibility as well when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll talk about what's happening in my office. I'm the Chief Officer of Scientific Workforce Diversity, and we have a lot of things ongoing that you may find of interest. And then I'll talk about the NIH Unite Initiative, which is an NIH-wide effort to address structural racism in biomedicine. But let's, again, look at the data. Why should we be focusing on diversity? Well, as articulated by Larry Tabak, currently serving as the NIH Director, a couple of other colleagues and I in Nature Medicine last November 21. November, yeah, 21, this 22 still. The sorts of problems that we are addressing in biomedicine are like trying to describe an elephant sightlessly. We have to go at it with a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different thoughts about how to answer the question, and that's informed by the life experiences of the various scientists. So scientists from different geographic areas, from different racial and ethnic groups, gender groups, etc., are necessary to be able to bring those differing perspectives and differing viewpoints in terms of answering questions. And what are the data? Lots of data in the business sector, growing data in the scientific sector, such as this really classic article by Freeman and Wong, where they looked at some 2.5 million published scientific articles to see whether what they called homophily, the likelihood that all of the authors are the same ethnicity, had an impact on where that article was published, whether it was associated with being published in a lower impact journal or having fewer citations, or the opposite. So this homophily index that they developed was basically an algorithm that they used to look at these 2.5 million articles, and they made an assessment of whether the authors were of the same ethnicity or not based upon the names. Recognizing that's not a perfect tool, but it was applied consistently across the 2.5 million articles. And the higher the homophily index, the more likely the authors were to be of the same ethnicity. And what they found is that the higher the homophily index, the lower the impact factor of the journal in which the article was published. And as you go down in terms of the homophily index, and in other words, more heterogeneity among the authors, the higher the impact factor. Now, of course, you'll note that this is associated with increased numbers of authors as well. And the type of science that is likely published with 10 authors may be very different than the type of science that's published with 2 authors. But even when they looked at geographic diversity based upon the addresses of the authors who are involved with the paper, or information diversity based upon how many papers were referenced as they were writing about the science, the impact factor and the citation percentile tended to be lower the greater the homogeneity. And then there's this lovely study by Haynes and colleagues that looked at the impact of diversity in a component ornithology, where birdsong was being evaluated. And that component was initially a male-dominated scientific area. And there is a dominant paradigm that birdsong followed particular patterns. But of course, the patterns were based upon the study of male birds. As female scientists went into the field and looked more broadly, it was found that there were actually gender-based differences in birdsong, subverting the dominant paradigm. Really vibrant example of the benefit of differing perspectives. And then there's this lovely report by Kozlowski and colleagues from PNAS earlier this year that looked at scholarly impact and distribution of race and gender of authors by field. So hopefully you can see my cursor. This is a heat map, your standard heat map, where the columns are white men, Black men, Latinos, Asian men, Asian women, Latinas, Black women, and white women. And you can see that there appear to be patterns with higher numbers of publications in health, psychology, and arts for the women as opposed to the men, and higher publications in science, technology, engineering and technology, mathematics and physics for the men, much less so for the women. And they also observed that the women tended to publish less than the men, which is not a new observation. They come to the conclusion that a different body of knowledge would be produced in the absence of these inequities. And they make the value judgment that this body would more closely reflect the spectrum of topics relevant across society. And they make suggestions about providing resources for historically underfunded research areas. Things like health disparities research would fall into this area that tends to be underfunded. And connection of scientists from underrepresented groups to high prestige networks and topics. So some examples. Hopefully, this translates in the way that, for you, in the way that it does for us, that inclusion equates to excellence in science. Do we currently include everyone? Do we currently utilize the full talent pool that's out there? We have some opportunities for enhancements. This shows in the dark blue R01 equivalent awardees from NIH. As you well know, in those cases where tenure is still available, having an R1 is really important. The orange bar shows representation of that segment of the population in the STEM workforce, and the green bar shows the representation of that segment of the population in general. And as you can see, non-Hispanic whites and Asians are well represented, but there's some opportunities for more involvement of Hispanics or Latinos and Blacks or African Americans. And when you look at the professoriate in terms of gender, you see that at the entry levels, at the instructor level, underrepresented women and well-represented women actually represent more than half of the population of instructors. This is underrepresented men, well-represented men. But as you move up in the professoriate to the full professor and the department chair level, you don't see as much diversity as in the entry point. And thus we are not taking advantage of the full pool of talent. So what do we do about this? How do we promote inclusive excellence? We know that there are lots of things that we can do at the individual level, providing mentoring, tutorials, supplements, etc. This is all absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. There also need to be interventions at the institutional level to be assured that people are in environments that are supportive and sustainable. And you'll see that addressed in some of the things that I will tell you shortly that NIH is doing. My colleagues and I did an article for Nature Communications earlier this year that further discusses this. This is specifically related to women. It's co-authored with Dr. Deneen Clayton, who's the director of the Office of Research in Women's Health, and a couple of other NIH colleagues, but it's as applicable to any population that you have to have a culture that is expecting everyone to be at the table. We can't have the pyramidal structure that has been the tradition in the past in research and academia. And how do you do that? You have demonstrable leadership support, such as some of the commitments that have been made at NIH. You have action-oriented and accountable interventions that you're making. You look at what the data show from the women's, from the Office of Research in Women's Health. There have been initiatives to look at best practices for inclusion of women. There's a lot of data out there for inclusion of lots of different populations. We should work from that. And we should think about things particularly for women, but really for all groups that may be underrepresented in the biomedical and behavioral research community. Enhance flexibility options so that people don't feel that they have to go straight down a very narrow pathway to being successful. There should be on-ramps and off-ramps and lots of options to make sure that we're able to keep the talent that's out there. So what is NIH doing? As I alluded to, we have a DEIA strategic plan. This has come about because of a couple of mandates. For the fiscal year 21 NIH budget, there was a mandate that we develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan that included short and long-term goals to address racial, ethnic, and gender disparities at NIH, and that would identify and address barriers in access to NIH funding by investigators researching health disparities. Additionally, shortly after the Biden administration took over, there was an executive order which holds the weight of law for us as members of the executive branch to develop a diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility plan for the federal workforce. This is for all federal entities. So we have combined these two mandates in this plan that is forthcoming, hopefully shortly after the new year. What you will see in it is that we see our mission being to embrace, integrate, and strengthen DEIA across all NIH activities and services at NIH Mission. Our vision is to be a people-centered organization representative of our nation's diversity, where all people feel a sense of belonging as they advance the NIH mission. And we see us doing it through three primary objectives: by growing and sustaining DEIA through structural and cultural change, much of it looking inwardly, but some of it looking outwardly. And this will influence funding opportunity announcements that will be put out by NIH in the next 5 years. It's a 5-year plan. Objective 2 is to implement organizational practices to center and prioritize DEIA in the workforce. And objective 3 is to advance DEIA through research. So this is a little different than the standard NIH strategic plan. Usually research is first, but because there's such an emphasis on the people, we thought it appropriate to have the research objective, the third objective, as opposed to the first objective. We've been working on this for a while now. It's going through the final editing by the contractor that will help us to publish this. And as I said, hopefully it'll come out shortly after the new year. It will be a blueprint that will help, if you choose to peruse it, you should anticipate that there will be things forthcoming from NIH that match what's being said within this plan. It's meant as an umbrella plan to capture all of the other diversity efforts we have ongoing, including the Minority Health and Health Disparity Strategic Plan, the Tribal Health Research Plan, the Women's Health Plan, the Consulate Plan, and the Sex Gender Minority Research Office Plan. What are some of the things that you'll see when this is released? You'll see things highlighted like the Native American Research Centers for Health. This is a program that's been around for a long period of time. When I was in Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma was very proud to be involved with this initiative that helps support opportunities for conducting research and career enrichment, meeting the needs of American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and tribally based organizations. We have 34 tribes in Oklahoma. There's also the Community Engagement Alliance against COVID-19, clearly started at the height of the pandemic, that was developed to allow NIH to make outreach and to engage with ethnic and racial minority communities who were being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. It was very clear that we needed to leverage relationships between our funded researchers and local community engaged leaders to make that outreach. And it was also very clear that we needed to not helicopter in and helicopter out. So the plan is to keep these sorts of engagements as an ongoing thing in preparation for what the next pandemic might bring. You'll see highlighted the fact that we have stepped back and developed expectations for our leadership. We have 27 institutes and centers, and every single one of those institute and center directors have a performance standard in DEIA now, including evaluating what's going on within their institute or center that might be inequitable with a racial and ethnic equity lens. And when it's expectation for the institute or center director, that means it's an expectation for all of the staff, because all the staff have to help that institute or center director be able to report at the end of the fiscal year what they've accomplished here. So this is a permanent change in the way that we're approaching things at NIH. Additionally, as part of the NIH Unite Initiative, the DEIA performance standard, and a review of NIH Director Awards, it was found that there were inequities in the way that we give out these awards that are NIHwide awards to recognize people. In my introduction, it was mentioned that I'd received one of these, that it tended to be skewed towards people who were professional degree holders, higher paid staff, and it wasn't fair to other staff who are just as important for making our scientific enterprise move forward. They were not as well recognized. So that has been reevaluated and is being revamped. So there's more equity in the consideration of categories for the NIH Directors Awards. So what are we doing from the Consulate perspective? I'm very honored to have been selected as the second Chief Officer of Scientific Workforce Diversity for NIH. This is a position that was developed in response to a science article from 2011 by Donna Ginter and colleagues that showed that there was a persistent disadvantage in receipt of R01 grant funding from NIH by race ethnicity. Initially, it was across the board: African Americans, Black, Hispanic Latinos, Asians, American Indians, Alaska Natives. After controlling for multiple factors, English as a first language, where are you trained, where are you working, et cetera, there was a persistent disadvantage for Black and African American scientists that led then NIH Director Francis Collins to turn to his advisory committee and ask for suggestions as to what should be done. They suggested, as one of the interventions, having an individual who reports to the NIH director and has overview and oversight across NIH to make sure that we are addressing issues with regards to scientific workforce diversity. Dr. Hannah Valentine from Stanford was the founding Coswood in 2014. As she returned to Stanford at the end of September 2020, I was asked to be the acting Coswood from October until the end of May, and I'm very honored to have been selected as the permanent Coswood. Because I'd had that opportunity, we were able to hit the ground pretty quickly and come out with a strategic plan for 22 to 26 that talks about our vision to enable NIH and NIH-funded institutions to benefit from the nation's full range of talent and foster creativity and innovation in science. Again, harkening back to that question, what's the impact of diversity? Why is it important? Our mission is to be the NIH thought leader in the science of scientific workforce diversity, using evidence-based approaches to catalyze cultures of inclusive excellence. How do we do that? We build the evidence using NIH as a test bed. We disseminate the evidence across the biomedical research workforce ecosystem, and we act on the evidence by advancing integrated institutional-wide systems. Some examples. Building the evidence suggests that if you build an inclusive culture by fostering cohort engagement, mentoring, building community, and enhancing skills, you can have individuals who have an interest in and a track record in diversity, equity, inclusion be very impactful on the whole environment. This has been modeled in what's called the Distinguished Scholars Program and the Intramural Program. So we've launched something we call the 21st Century Scholars Program that's designed focusing on our extramural program staff, our scientific review officers, and our health sciences administrators to become a self-reinforcing culture of mentoring and support, focusing on DEIA and focusing on the evidence. We had our first cohort to graduate in September. We will we'll start recruiting for another cohort we've actually announced it. Our hypothesis here is that after doing this for 4 to 5 years, about 10% of the HSAs and SROs at NIH will have gone through this program, will be DEIA advocates, and that may translate into funding opportunity announcements that are more DEIA friendly and potentially bringing people into pay status or paying their grants out of discretionary pay. Because as you know, every IC has kind of a discretionary funding level for grants. And I can tell you, having served as the Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging for 13 years, that program staff can really impact that. And so hopefully these program staff will be thinking in a very broad fashion about who might be good candidates for discretionary funding. In terms of disseminating the evidence, we have what we call the Scientific Workforce Diversity Seminar Series. Our November 17th offering addressed whether diversity supplements impact career success. A star-studded cast of NIHers and non-NIHers. Dr. Dallin Boatwright is author of a really lovely JAMA internal medicine article that looked at the use of diversity supplements across NIH, demonstrating that the diversity supplement use increased exponentially since the Ginter study, but still less than 5% of R01 grants have a diversity supplement associated with them. Dr. Jose Luxinger, as you can see, a very accomplished scientist, talked very eloquently about how a diversity supplement got his career started. And the NIHers here provided data about evaluations of the impact of diversity supplements. The takeaway point being that they seem to be associated with people having successful careers. We have a couple of other things that are coming up in this 22-23 season. February 2nd, we will have a report out from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine study on advancing anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM organizations. And in May, we're looking forward to hopefully collaborating with United Kingdom Research Institute, or UKRI, on how mentoring impacts diversity in the biomedical and behavioral research workforce. We also, last year, started working on the evidence. And the evidence shows that mentoring makes a difference in the success of scientists, and that women, scientists from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, scientists with disabilities, and others don't necessarily come with a built-in network of mentoring. And as you all know, mentoring is not well compensated. So we put out a notice of special interest in administrative supplements to recognize excellence in DEIA mentoring. These were supplements that had to be built upon already funded research. And we got an overwhelming response. We prioritize mentors who will enhance outreach to scientists in keeping with the NIH Notice of Special Interest in Diversity. And with the help of our institute and center partners, we were able to give out or support 84 applications. That's only a 12% success rate, but it's a lot more. The institute, we paid, the Kozlowski office paid 2/3 of the cost. We said we were going to pay a certain amount towards this. And then another third was contributed by the institutes and centers because they thought this was a great idea. Such a good idea that we're doing it again this year. We have announced this notice as of the middle of November. There are 25 institute centers and offices that have signed on. You can see the list here. The only institutes and centers that have not signed on are the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Strokes. They have the Landis Award that they prefer to focus on, and the Fogarty International Center because of the US-centric focus of this, but everyone else is participating. And we're looking for PIs who are supported by no more than one independent research grant. So if you have more than one R01, you're not eligible. If you have an R01 that doesn't have a mentoring component or doesn't have a diversity supplement associated with it, you're not eligible, but lots of other people are. And I would encourage you to go to diversity.nih.gov. On our landing page, there's lots of information, 54 FAQs. And then there's the NIH Unite Initiative. The NIH Unite Initiative was driven by the events of 2020 when we all saw the disparate morbidity and mortality of the COVID pandemic. And Labor Day, no, that's Memorial Day weekend of 20, the videotaped murder of George Floyd. And shortly after this was publicly unveiled, February 26th of 2021, we saw the killings of 6 Asian women in Atlanta. All of these things helped to bring into sharp relief the ongoing reality of racial and ethnic injustice in our country. And we at NIH felt that we could not be silent. We recognized that structural racism, we said we want to end structural racism, and we recognize that it's a much broader problem than what we can address just within NIH, but we are the largest funder of biomedical and behavioral research in the United States, and we do have some influence to address it, at least in that sphere. So the NIH Unite Initiative with UNITE representing 5 working groups within Unite is looking in 3 primary content areas: health disparities and minority health research, what we can do internally, because we have to have our own house in order. We're going to ask external institutions to look at greater equity among their staff. And some highlights of some of the things that we've done are things like looking at morbidity and mortality associated by race and ethnicity. We've known for a long time that African Americans and Blacks lag behind whites and certainly Latinos in terms of longevity. We also have found that with the COVID pandemic, everyone has had a decrease in longevity. In fact, when normalized against non-Hispanic whites, it looks almost like this is called the Latino Paradox, because Latinos and Hispanics have just about the same amount of hypertension and diabetes as Blacks, and yet they have longer longevity. But that paradox seemed to be going away with the COVID pandemic, loss in longevity for African Americans and Blacks as well. And our goal was to do things, not just admire the problem. So one of the first things we did in March of 2021 was to announce opportunities for transformative research to address health disparities and advance health equity. And we're committing up to $58 million over 5 years for the 11 awards that were announced at the end of fiscal year 21. 6 of those were just in general to address this, 5 of these at minority serving institutions, and there was additional competition in fiscal year 22. I have yet to see the announced winners. Additionally, this fiscal year, we have something that we call the COMPASS Initiative, Community Partnerships to Advance Science for Society. The goal here is to catalyze, deploy, and evaluate community-led health equity structural interventions that leverage partnerships across multiple sectors, and to develop a new health equity research model for community-led multi-sectoral structural interventions. So it's community-led health structural interventions, it's health equities hubs, it's a coordinating center, and there are 2 FOAs that are out, I think both closing in January, one for these community entities and one for coordinating center. Very different from the usual approach to things at NIH, because it's the community that's dictating what the research will be. It's the community that's selected before the scientists. Additionally, we've seen a really nice increase in funding opportunity announcements related to health disparities and minority health from 2018 to 2022, an indicator that we are leaning in the way that we need to. A lot more analysis needs to be done of this, but just to show you our intent here. When it comes to the internal workforce, there's a lot that's going on. I mentioned the performance standard for the student center directors. I mentioned the change in the awards process. We also have this lovely project called the Power of an Inclusive Workforce Recognition Project. It is the brainchild of Dr. Sadhana Jackson, shown here, bottom row, second from the left. She is an intramural tenure track scientist who speaks very eloquently in this stat op-ed that's referenced here about walking the halls of NIH and not feeling represented or included. And that's kind of standardly the case in most longstanding academic and research institutions. And what has been done is to add images of the full range of individuals who contribute to the success of an NIH. What you see at the top is at baseline, building 31, where most of the institutes and centers have their offices. This is a representation of what the artwork looks like, the team that did it. Lots of different colors and patterns, scientists, non-scientists, early career individuals, later career individuals, people with disabilities, the whole range. And I have to point out this display, which is just outside of my office. I'm on the third floor of what's called Building 1, 2 floors up from NIH Director. And this is a display of the Institute and Center directors. And kudos to Dr. Francis Collins, the NIH Director who served from 2009 till December of last year. When I arrived in 2008, there was not nearly the diversity that you see represented here. But what you see here, of the 27 Institute and Center directors, 10 are women. There are 2 African Americans, 2 Hispanic Latinos, 3 Asians, a lot more in the way of diversity. Not to say that we are where we need to be. You just go one level down and there's not nearly that degree of diversity. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're working towards it. And then in terms of the external workforce, we, in keeping with the data that shows that bringing in cohorts of people and who are interested in and have a track record in diversity, that you can work with them and help them to be successful in getting tenure and getting NIH funding, we have something called the Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustainable Transformation Initiative. We started this in fiscal year 21. This is the first set of institutions that receive these awards. They are committed to recruiting early career scientists with that interest and track record, making sure that their environment is supportive of those individuals and supporting them through to tenure. So you see high resource institutions, low resource institutions, a collaboration between Tuskegee and University of Alabama at Birmingham. The fiscal year 22 cohorts, similarly high resource, low resource, collaboration between University of Maryland and Baltimore and the University of Maryland and Morehouse School of Medicine. There's a third and final group of cohorts that have submitted their applications. The reviews were completed in the last month or so. The team is looking carefully at the summary statements, and I'm sure we'll be bringing to us on the coordinating committee. They're basically 4 IC directors and me who are in charge of overseeing this, bring forward some recommendations to us. But at the end of this, there'll be at least 15 cohorts at various academic and research institutions, 150 faculty who are going to be supported towards success. So that's one thing that's being done. We also have an enhanced means for reporting issues with regards to sexual harassment, discrimination, or racial harassment and discrimination at this URL that's shown here. And you're welcome to my slides when this presentation is done. In the very near future, there'll be some additional announcements about how to address issues with regards to discrimination and harassment. In grant award notices, institutions will be made aware that they are expected to establish codes of conduct that define expectations of integrity and ethical values and criteria of competence for their personnel. And this would include, but not be limited to, assuring that work environments are free of discriminatory harassment. This is something new for us, to be in the notice of grant award, to be able to hold the institution accountable. So that's something to look forward to. We're also looking at trying to have more funding opportunity announcements, include plans to enhance diverse perspectives. The NIHwide Brain Initiative did this initially, where you take into consideration in the scoring of the grant the diversity of the team, whether it's based on a geography, discipline, characteristics in the notice of special interest and diversity, and it's part of the scoring, as opposed to, for instance, human subjects research, where you score the grant and then separately, adequate inclusion or not. We're excited about that. We're looking forward to that being used more regularly. And then we have things that are ongoing or imminent. We've expanded what's called the Science Education Partnership Awards program, originally just led by the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, now with 17 institute centers and offices signed on. This is a K-12 STEM initiative that helps to make sure that we are taking advantage of those very young, bright minds, because we know that science identity is often formed as early as middle school. And we know that in our K-12 population, there's quite a bit of diversity. So we're looking forward to the impact of that. It'll be a while before we see it, but it's great to be able to expand it. We also have concepts that were approved by the National Institute of General Medical Sciences that will be funding opportunity announcements that coming out, published hopefully in the next month or so. Institutional climate assessment and DEIA action plan development grants, kind of the first initiative that I described to you, without the money for the cohorts, but with the money to look at the environment. Excellence in DEIA investigators grants, a great accompaniment to the administrative supplements that my office is giving. This will be something you can apply for whether or not you have NIH funding, and it would be a competitive award that you'd have for 4 or 5 years, as opposed to 1 year or 2-year supplement. And special instrumentation grant program for minority serving institutions. We already have that program in general, but this will be focused on minority serving institutions. Additionally, the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities approved a concept for research capacity building, needs assessment, and action plan development grants for under-resourced institutions. And then we're going to have a prize competition for excellence in DEIA at the institutional level, to acknowledge transformative cultures, systems, and projects, and to highlight practices that have resulted in measurable change and created a more inclusive environment. We think, my team is leading this, that we will be able to announce this by February or March. And I would just close out this part of describing Unite with this quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And that's my answer when people ask me, well, what about me? I don't see myself in this. What we're seeing is that all of the programs that we're bringing forward are proving to be beneficial broadly, because of course, as a federal entity, we can't just focus on race or ethnicity. We think broadly. So, in summary, I hope that I've given you a compelling argument for focusing on diversity. I hope that you will take away from this that there are a lot of things going on at NIH. We have the strategic plan, the DEIA strategic plan coming out in January. We have things that are led by my office. We have the NIH Unite Initiative. And I hope that I'll get a chance. I hope I didn't take too much time to hear what you are doing at the Wistar Institute. Please do. Take advantage of opportunities to make outreach. We have a blog, a newsletter, our website. Would love to hear from you. And I'll stop right now to be able to answer any questions you might have or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernard, for that insightful and engaging lecture. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us today. So we have a few minutes, a couple minutes for a couple of quick questions. And my colleague, Dr. Amelia Escolano, who is on site, will be helping addressing some of those questions. Amelia? So while Amelia is coming to the let me begin with perhaps one question that we have received.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask around if there are any questions here. Please raise your hands. Otherwise, Jesse, please feel free to go ahead with questions in the chat. We have a question here, Jesse.
Thank you, Amelia. So let me begin with one important question. We have received a couple about the same topic, and this is about individuals from diverse sexual orientation and diverse gender identities who are not currently officially recognized as underrepresented group by the NIH. So the audience is interested in knowing what upcoming efforts at NIH to materially support scientists from diverse gender identity groups.
So I would point out that the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities and ARC have designated individuals who are LGBTQ+ as a health disparities population. So that population is the subject of research. I'd also point out that I think people are referencing the Notice of Special Interest in Diversity, where it calls out particular groups. But if you read it carefully, it says these are examples. It's not an exclusive or a comprehensive listing. And it's particularly useful when thinking about applying for diversity supplement. And when applying for a diversity supplement, it's up to the applicants to make the argument for the researcher being from an underrepresented group. And I can say from practical personal experience, lots of different groups have been justified based upon the needs of that organization. We also have our Sex Gender Minority Research Office that has been really wonderful in advocating for the needs of LGBTQ+ population. They led the organization and recruited funds for the National Academy study that recently came out that is going to be invaluable in allowing us to get more precise understanding of who among the scientific workforce is out there from the LGBTQ+ population, because that's been one of our big challenges. We've not had accurate or consistent data. Please do be patient with us. Getting recommendations from an organization like NASM built into all of the various systems in the government for gathering data does take time, but that process is underway.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. Another important question is whether there is any way to rethink race and ethnicity categories to better reflect the workforce. For example, the category of Asians should be disaggregated. The Committee of 100 has recently released a report suggesting that South Asians and Southeast Asian and East Asians are better categories and reveal disparities better. Also, Middle Eastern people are not represented in our current categories. Your leadership in this area would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you for raising that. And yes, that has been a point of conversation as well, because we do recognize that lumping people together doesn't allow you to see the differences that may occur in various components of that lumped together group. It is a complex process, again, just like trying to get better means of measuring LGBTQ+ populations, better understanding the different groups in Asian populations, Hispanic, Latino populations, even African American Black populations is a process. I can tell you after 14 years in the federal government, but the conversations are ongoing, and we will see whether we can get greater precision going forward.
Thank you. We have a provocative question here. How would you respond when institutions resist equity because they fear to get too political?
I would say that I don't see it as a political issue. It's an issue of doing the best science. If you want to make sure that you're being creative and innovative, you need to have a big table and a lot of different perspectives, like with the data that I showed at the beginning of this presentation. Traditionally, science academia has been very, as I said, pyramidal. You get to the peak and it's only a small number of people, but you need those other perspectives. And when you look at the demographics of this country, as I said, for the K through 12 population, there's quite a bit of diversity there. You don't have a lot of those diverse minds at the table, you're missing out on talent. So if we're going to maintain our leadership role in biomedical and behavioral research across the globe, we need to take advantage of all of that talent. So maybe from the standpoint of wanting to be competitive with other countries, that's political, but it's not political in the way that sometimes it may be taken here in the US.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Amelia, do you have any questions on site?
Yes, we have a question here by Dr. Weiner.
Hi, thank you so much for the really important and encompassing presentation. One of the things that's discussed frequently and what makes people stay in a field, for example, the valley of death that different fields have, once you get through your initial training and get to the next levels, and that comes across many different fields, not just science. So how many of these initiatives really can be targeted to that valley of death where you're about to lose the real transition people, the more senior, when you're finally getting to the point of leadership, because those leaders are really the people that represent, for the junior people who they're looking up to. So, that would be very helpful to understand. Thank you.
Great question. And so I translate that into, what happens, for instance, after that first R01. We have things in place to try to make sure that we give extra consideration for early stage investigators, for new investigators. We actually have to report, we have targets of how many of these individuals will be funded each year, and we've done very well along those lines. But after that first R1, what happens? And so we have another initiative called the Next Generation of Researchers Initiative, where in the last many years, we've tried to systematically look at who has R01 funding that will not, if a project that they have that is in that discretionary zone doesn't get funded, will end up with no funding. And a systematic effort at each institute and center level to make sure that they taking that into consideration when they're doing their final funding list. And when you look at who those individuals are, they're often those people who, the equivalent of the valley of death, the associate professor who's, maybe their first grant is ending and they need additional support, or someone who's been very productive but is in a dry period. So that's one thing that we're doing in a very systematic fashion for all the institutes and centers to try to be helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. Unfortunately, we are running out of time now. We have a couple more questions, but we'll send them to Dr. Bernard by email, and so she will hopefully have a chance to address them. With that, we want to thank our speaker again one more time for this insightful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today and to help making us this event a success. Especially again to Dr. Bernard for leading such an important initiative. We look forward to having you all again back in 2023, and happy holidays to everyone. Thank you.